Welcome to Top 10 Secret, where terrifying mysteries are unveiled. Do you dare step into the world of spine-chilling ghost stories, haunting mysteries, and unexplained paranormal events? Brace yourself, because once you listen, you'll never feel safe again. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, so you never miss the scariest horror stories. And if you're brave enough, share your own creepy experiences in the comments below. Are you ready? Let's dive into the darkest secrets. Story 1. Have you ever felt like someone was watching you, even when no one was around? A woman notices a strange man standing motionless outside her apartment every night. He doesn't look away, doesn't move, until she realizes he's getting closer. If you want to know what happens next, don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next terrifying story. The shadow in the night. Tonight, just like every night before, she saw him again. A tall, motionless figure stood across the street, directly facing the window of her apartment. He didn't do anything, just stood there, silently. But his eyes, though she couldn't quite see them in the darkness, felt like they were piercing through the glass, locking onto her. At first, she thought he was just a passerby, someone who happened to stop there for a moment before moving on. But no. Night after night, he remained. When the streetlight cast its dim glow onto the sidewalk, his shadow stretched long and menacing. He never moved. He never left before she did. Whenever she peeked through the curtains, he was already there, waiting. She tried to convince herself that he might be a homeless man, a drunk wanderer, or someone waiting for a ride. But the unease inside her only grew. The feeling of being watched haunted her even when she wasn't looking. His image burned into her mind. A figure standing in the darkness, unmoving like a statue, yet carrying an invisible, suffocating presence. One night, she decided to test something. She turned off all the lights, drew the curtains shut, and sat in her chair, eyes fixed on the fabric blocking her view. Her breath was slow. Her heart pounded against her ribs. She waited. 5 minutes. 10. 20. The silence in the apartment made even the faintest sounds deafening. The ticking clock, the wind whistling through the window frame, the heavy thudding of her heartbeat. Finally, she carefully lifted a small corner of the curtain and peeked outside. He was still there, but this time, he was closer. She yanked the curtain shut, her whole body trembling. No way. She had been watching. He hadn't moved an inch. But now, the distance between him and her building had shortened significantly. Her breath hitched. A chill ran down her spine. She couldn't let this continue. She had to do something. With shaky hands, she grabbed her phone and dialed the police. Her voice quivered as she reported a suspicious man watching her for days. The dispatcher asked if he had made any threats or attempted to approach her. She hesitated. He hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, hadn't done anything outright dangerous. But his presence alone was an unspoken warning she couldn't ignore. Less than 10 minutes later, police sirens blared outside. She rushed to the window and pulled the curtain aside. But he was gone. No trace, no shadow, nothing but an empty sidewalk beneath the flickering streetlight. A police officer knocked on her door, asking her for details. She tried her best to explain, but even she realized how absurd her story sounded. A man stood outside for several nights, yet the moment the police arrived, he disappeared. No crime committed, no threats made, no evidence. The officer gave her a simple piece of advice. If you see him again, call us immediately. But she wasn't sure he had ever really left. He could still be out there, hidden in the darkness, waiting. She shut the door, double-locked it, trying to convince herself that it was all in her head. But the unease never faded. Somewhere deep inside, she knew He was still here, and he would be back. Extreme tension. Every night, he was still there. Tall, motionless, like a soulless statue across the street. She kept telling herself it had to be a coincidence, that maybe he wasn't actually watching her. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. His eyes, even from a distance, sent an unbearable sense of unease crawling through her skin. He didn't need to get any closer. Just standing there, silently and persistently, was enough to make her feel suffocated. At first, she chose to ignore it. Every time she caught a glimpse of him through the window, she quickly turned away, convincing herself she was overthinking. But as the nights passed, the fear seeped into every moment of her life. She started having trouble sleeping. Every time she closed her eyes, she could see him, still standing there, waiting. He had never made a direct threat, never even moved, yet his mere presence was enough to rob her of sleep and appetite. She felt like she was losing control, becoming obsessed. Each night, she found herself pulling back the curtain, checking, just to make sure he was still there. But that was the most terrifying part. He was always there. He never left, never arrived earlier or later. He always appeared at the exact moment when darkness swallowed the street, when the streetlights began to flicker weakly. Why was he there? What did he want from her? The more she thought about it, the harder it became to breathe. She couldn't take it anymore. She had to do something. With trembling hands, she picked up her phone and dialed the police. Her voice was shaky as she reported the strange man who had been watching her night after night. "Has he done anything suspicious, ma'am?" The officer's voice on the other end was calm but skeptical. She opened her mouth to respond, then hesitated. He had never done anything. He just stood there. No chasing, no breaking in, no threats. And yet, his mere presence felt like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. "Would you like us to send someone over to check?" She gripped the phone tightly, her eyes still locked on the shadowy figure outside. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. Then she took a deep breath and nodded, even though they couldn't see her. "Yes, please. Come as soon as possible." Hanging up, she still didn't look away from the window. Her breathing grew unsteady. A part of her feared that if she so much as blinked, he would disappear. 10 minutes. 15. No sign of the police yet. Then, her blood ran ice cold. He moved, not standing still like before. He had taken a step forward, just one small step. But he had never done that before. She stumbled back, feeling as if the air had been sucked out of her lungs. If before he was just an eerie presence now, he had broken the pattern. He was getting closer. The sudden chime of her doorbell made her jump, her heart pounding so violently she thought it might burst from her chest. The police. She rushed to the door, yanking it open. 2 officers stood there, their expressions sharp, scanning the area. "Where is he?" one of them asked, eyes sweeping the street. She turned back to point, but the spot across the street was empty. No one was there, no shadow, no sign that anyone had ever been standing there at all. A cold wave of dread washed over her. She couldn't believe what she was seeing, or rather, what she wasn't seeing. He was just there. Her voice was barely above a whisper. One officer looked at her, a mix of sympathy and skepticism in his gaze. "Are you sure you weren't mistaken?" She opened her mouth to protest but hesitated. Even she wasn't sure anymore. She had seen him move, but now he was gone, without a trace. The officers did a quick check around the area but found nothing suspicious. Before leaving, they gave her the usual warning. "If he comes back, call us." She closed the door, pressing her back against it, her heart still hammering. Had he really disappeared? Or was he just closer now? She didn't know. But one thing was certain. This wasn't over yet. disappeared without a trace. She stood frozen by the window, her eyes locked on the empty space across the street. She was certain she had seen him, tall, motionless, like a shadow blending into the night. But now, there was only an empty sidewalk, silent under the dim glow of the streetlights. He was gone. No sound, no sign. She blinked rapidly, trying to make sense of what she had just witnessed. She couldn't have imagined it. He had been there for so many nights, never leaving until the lights in her apartment went dark. But the moment the police arrived, he vanished, like he had never existed. A chill ran down her spine. The two officers beside her exchanged glances, their expressions wavering between skepticism and sympathy. One of them scanned the quiet street before turning to her. "Are you sure you didn't mistake something else for a person?" She opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. How could she be mistaken? This wasn't just some coincidence. He had been there. Every night. He was standing right there. Her voice trembled, but she forced herself to stay composed. "I saw him just minutes ago." The officers exchanged another look. "We'll check the area. Stay inside." She stood by the door, watching them step onto the sidewalk, sweeping their flashlights along the road and into the narrow alleys. But she knew they wouldn't find anything. She knew because he wasn't just some ordinary stalker. Clenching her fists, she dug her nails into her palms. A suffocating frustration spread through her chest. He was toying with her. He wanted her to unravel. And the worst part was, he was succeeding. 10 minutes later, the officers returned. One shook his head. "There's no one out there." She looked at them, feeling a sinking mix of frustration and helplessness. No one believed her. No one saw what she saw. "If you notice anything unusual, call us immediately," one officer said, his voice professional but carrying an undertone of detachment, like he no longer took this situation seriously. They left, and she was alone again. Alone in the suffocating silence. She locked the door tightly, pressing her back against it, her heartbeat still unsteady. Had he really disappeared? Or was he simply closer now? She walked slowly into the living room, pulling the curtains shut, forcing herself not to look outside. Maybe, just maybe, it was truly over. Taking a deep breath, she stepped into her bedroom, but the unease didn't fade. She checked every corner, searched the bathroom, opened her closet, even peered under the bed. Nothing. And yet, the anxiety still clung to her. She sat on the edge of her bed, burying her face in her hands. The apartment was disturbingly quiet, but something about the silence felt wrong. Then, she realized, it was too quiet. Every night she would hear distant traffic, the wind rattling against the windows, or faint noises from the neighboring apartments. But tonight, there was nothing. Not a single sound. Not even the slightest noise. She swallowed hard, lifting her head slowly, staring at the bedroom door. That feeling returned, the feeling of being watched. She turned, her eyes cautiously scanning the corner of the room. And then, she froze. Him. He was there, standing in her room. His eyes were wide, empty, unblinking. She hadn't heard him move, no footsteps, no sound. But now he was here, just a few feet away. Her breath caught in her throat. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body refused to move. He didn't speak, didn't make a single gesture. He only stood there, staring at her. 1 second. 2 seconds. Time seemed to stretch endlessly. Then, the lights went out. Darkness swallowed everything. And she knew. He was closer now. He is here. Darkness swallowed the room. A thick, suffocating blackness that twisted everything into something unreal and distorted. Her heart pounded violently against her ribs, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. But no sound escaped her lips. She wanted to scream, to jump out of bed, but fear wrapped around her like invisible chains holding her in place. She knew he was still here, inside this very room. Just seconds ago, she had seen him. Those hollow, unblinking eyes, filled with something indescribable. They were still there, staring at her, piercing through the oppressive night. She hadn't heard his footsteps, but she knew. He was closer now. The darkness made it impossible to tell where he was. Was he standing in the corner? Or had he already reached the side of her bed? She fought to keep the rising panic at bay. She couldn't just sit here and wait. She had to do something. Her trembling hand fumbled across the sheets, searching for her phone. If she could turn on the flashlight, if she could call someone. Then a sound, a faint clicking noise, like fingernails scraping gently against wood. She froze. The sound came from her right beside her bed. Holding her breath, she forced herself to stay still. The air in the room felt heavy, unnaturally cold. She could feel it, the presence of something, or someone, standing just inches away. A wave of sheer terror crashed over her. He was no longer just watching her from afar, no longer just a harmless shadow outside her window. He was here. Slowly, she pulled her legs closer to her body, trying not to make a sudden movement. But the moment she shifted even slightly, click. This time, the sound came from right next to her ear. He was standing beside her. Her breath caught in her throat. Cold sweat trickled down her forehead, her shirt clinging to her damp skin. A part of her wanted to bolt, to run for the door. But the other part, the part paralyzed by sheer terror, warned her that if she moved, if she made even the slightest mistake, he would strike. She had to think. She had to do something. Her phone. It was still there, on the nightstand. But to grab it, she would have to reach out, into the darkness where she couldn't see him. She swallowed hard, inching her hand toward the edge of the bed. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. Her fingertips brushed against the phone. A freezing hand clamped around her wrist. She screamed, thrashing wildly, but the grip was like iron, ice cold, unyielding, inhuman. With all her strength, she yanked her arm free, rolling off the bed and crashing onto the floor. Pain shot through her side, but she didn't care. She scrambled toward the door, hands frantically searching for the light switch. Click. The light blazed to life. She spun around, her eyes wide, chest heaving. There was no one there. The room was empty. No shadow, no figure, no trace that anyone else had been inside. But the numbness in her wrist lingered, right where the icy grip had held her. Her skin was still deathly cold, as if she had touched something that did not belong to this world. Shaking, she backed against the door, her breathing erratic. She knew he had been here. He had touched her. So why was he gone? Or was he still here, just somewhere she couldn't see? A shiver crawled down her spine. Her eyes darted around the room, scanning every inch. The closet door was slightly ajar. The bathroom door trembled just slightly. Maybe he was still there, watching her, waiting. She knew she couldn't sleep. She couldn't turn off the lights. But even with every inch of the room illuminated, she couldn't shake the most terrifying feeling of all. He was still here, just waiting for the right moment to appear again. The horrifying truth. She gasped for breath, her entire body trembling. The room was still flooded with light, yet the glow did nothing to dispel the suffocating terror closing in around her. He was still here. She didn't need to see him, didn't need to hear him. She felt his presence. Cold, invisible, yet more terrifying than anything she had ever known. Pressing her back against the wall, her eyes darted frantically, searching for an escape. The door was locked. The window was too high. Her phone. Where was her phone? She stumbled, scanning the room. It was gone. She was certain it had been on the nightstand beside her bed, but now it had disappeared. No, that was impossible. Her hands shook as she tore through the sheets, throwing everything onto the floor, and then, looking for this, a whisper, right behind her. Her breath hitched, her body froze, his voice. Slowly, as if an unseen force controlled her, she turned around, and she saw him. He stood there, in the middle of the room, right in front of her. A tall, motionless shadow, but his eyes burned red like twin flames. He was no longer a fleeting specter in the dark. This time, he was real. She wanted to scream, wanted to run, but her legs were paralyzed. She could only stand there, face to face with pure horror. He chuckled softly, the low, guttural sound echoing through the room. "You know the truth now, don't you?" She didn't understand. What was he talking about? He tilted his head, his glowing red eyes glinting with amusement. "Did you think I just arrived?" Her breath caught in her throat. No. I've been here for a long time. For a very, very long time." She shook her head, trying to deny it. No, that wasn't true. But then, the memories came flooding back. The strange dreams, the feeling of being watched, the noises in the dead of night. He was never gone. Since the day she moved into this apartment, since the very first moment she stepped inside. He had always been there, watching, waiting. And now, he no longer needed to hide. She stepped back, heart hammering wildly in her chest. "What do you want?" she choked out. He smiled. "You." A freezing gust of wind howled through the room. The lights flickered violently. She screamed, lunging for the door, pounding against it. It wouldn't open. She spun around. He was gone. The room was empty. No shadow, no cold presence, only an eerie silence. She staggered backward, her mind reeling. Was it over? Panting, she tried to steady herself. Maybe it had all been in her head. Maybe she was just exhausted. Shaking, she stumbled toward the bed, collapsing onto it, clutching her head. And then she heard it. A soft chuckle. Right beside her ear. She screamed. Everything went black. The next morning, when the landlord entered, the room was completely empty. No sign of the girl, no trace of her belongings. Only a large mirror standing in the center of the room. And inside it, the girl stared out, eyes wide open, mouth frozen in silence, forever trapped within. Story 2. Have you ever felt a strange urge when standing in front of a mysterious place? Jake did too, and his small action unleashed a series of terrifying events. Don't forget to like, comment your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel to explore more mysterious stories. The Nameless Grave. Jake wandered along the narrow trail, where dense tree canopies blocked out the sunlight, casting an oppressively eerie atmosphere. The wind howled through the leaves, carrying ghostly whispers from an unseen world. A chilling sensation crawled up his spine, but he reassured himself. It was just his imagination. This trip was supposed to be a short adventure into the wilderness, yet the deeper he ventured, the more unsettled he felt. No signs of life, no traces of human presence. Only barren trees stretching their skeletal branches toward him, as if trying to ensnare him. Jake's heartbeat quickened as he stepped into a small clearing in the woods. There, in the middle of the clearing, lay a solitary grave. No tombstone, no name, just a mound of earth, abandoned and forgotten for what seemed like centuries. Jake froze. He didn't know why, but he felt inexplicably drawn to this grave. A strange mix of curiosity and unease crept into his mind, as if something was waiting for him to notice it. The wind stopped. The silence became suffocating. The only sound was his own heavy breathing echoing in his ears. Without thinking, Jake bent down and picked up a small stone, placing it atop the grave. It was an unconscious gesture, but the moment the stone touched the earth, a shiver ran through his entire body. The air grew heavy. It felt as though unseen eyes were watching his every move. Anxiety surged within him, yet he remained still, his heart hammering against his ribs. He turned and quickly left, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. But as he walked, something felt off. He could sense someone walking behind him. Footsteps echoed unnaturally, crunching on the dry leaves in perfect sync with his own. Jake stopped. He turned around. Nothing. No one. But the feeling remained, lingering like a shadow that refused to let go. That night, exhaustion consumed him. He collapsed onto his bed, desperate to forget the grave, the eerie footsteps, and the suffocating silence. But sleep was anything but peaceful. In his dream, he stood in a desolate cemetery, thick fog swirling around him. A shadowy figure emerged, a woman with long, disheveled hair, her hollow eyes filled with sorrow. Her pale lips moved as if trying to speak, but only the cold wind carried her silent cries. Jake jolted awake, heart pounding. His room was dark, yet something felt different. A deep chill settled into his bones, the same cold he felt at the grave. He took a shaky breath, telling himself it was just a dream. Just a dream. But it felt too real. The next day, unable to ignore the lingering dread, Jake returned to the grave. He needed answers. He needed to understand why this nightmare haunted him. And then, he saw it. The stone he had placed on the grave. It had been moved. No footprints, no signs of disturbance. Yet something, or someone, had touched it. A wave of cold dread washed over him. The feeling of being watched was back, stronger than ever. His breath came in short gasps, his instincts screaming at him to run. Dark clouds rolled across the sky, swallowing the daylight. A sharp gust of wind sliced through the air, carrying whispers, soft, sorrowful, and unmistakably real. Jake's mind raced. Should he leave? Or should he stay and uncover the truth? But deep down, he already knew. This was no ordinary forgotten grave. This was a restless soul reaching out from beyond. And now, it had noticed him. The nameless grave. Jake stood motionless before the nameless grave, a strange sensation creeping into his mind. He couldn't explain why, but he felt an unexplainable urge, as if an unseen voice was whispering in his ear, urging him to do something. His heart pounded against his ribs, and his hands trembled slightly as he bent down to pick up a small stone nearby. Without knowing why, he placed it on the grave, a quiet gesture of respect for the forgotten soul. But the moment the stone touched the earth, a chilling shiver ran down his spine. The air around him suddenly grew heavy, thick with an unnatural stillness that made it hard to breathe. A sudden gust of wind swept through, sending dry leaves spiraling into the air. The rustling of the trees echoed like distant, sorrowful whispers, making Jake instinctively glance around. A cold, unsettling feeling crawled over his skin. Someone was watching him. He couldn't see them, but the presence was there. Invisible. Unrelenting. He shook off the unease, convincing himself it was just a coincidence. But as he stepped back, his foot brushed against something, a cold, invisible force that sent a wave of goosebumps across his body. He shuddered, took a deep breath, and turned to leave. Then, a faint sound broke the silence. A soft, barely audible moan. fragile, like a breath carried by the wind. Jake froze. His pulse pounded in his ears as he turned his head, slowly, cautiously. Nothing. Just the lonely grave in the empty clearing. No one was there. It was just his imagination. Right? Not wanting to stay a second longer, Jake quickly left. But as he walked away, an uneasy feeling clung to him. The disturbing sense that he had done something he wasn't supposed to. He couldn't explain it, but deep down, he had an overwhelming certainty. Placing the stone on that grave had awakened something. Something that was never meant to be disturbed. That night, exhaustion pulled Jake into sleep almost instantly. But as soon as he closed his eyes, a nightmare consumed him. He found himself standing in a dark forest, thick fog rolling through the trees. In the distance, a shadowy figure emerged. A woman, her long, disheveled hair hanging over her face. She stood still, unmoving, yet Jake could feel her hollow eyes locked onto him. Then, a whisper drifted through the air. "Help me." The voice was cold, empty, filled with sorrow. Jake wanted to step back, to escape, but his body refused to move. His breath caught in his throat as the woman began to approach, slowly, deliberately. And just as her face came into focus, he jerked awake. His chest heaved, sweat drenched his skin. His room was dark and quiet, yet an unnatural chill lingered in the air. The same eerie cold he had felt at the grave. Taking a shaky breath, he tried to shake off the nightmare, but a deep unease settled in his chest. This wasn't just a dream. And the next day, Jake knew he had to go back. He needed to see the grave again, to prove to himself that it was all just a coincidence. But when he arrived, his stomach dropped. The stone he had placed on the grave was no longer there. It had been moved. No footprints. No sign of disturbance. Yet something, or someone, had touched it. A wave of dread crawled through him. Swallowing hard, he stepped closer. There were no signs that another person had been there. No tracks. No evidence. Yet the stone was no longer where he had left it. A sudden gust of wind howled through the trees, carrying with it a strange scent. Something damp, decayed, ancient. The air grew unnaturally still, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. Jake swallowed, stepping back. Then, right beside his ear, a whisper. "Don't leave." A sharp gasp escaped him as he spun around. Nothing. The forest was empty, but Jake could feel it. A presence, watching, waiting. His breath came in ragged gasps, his body trembling with an unshakable fear. This was no coincidence. He had uncovered something buried in silence for too long, and now, it had noticed him. The nightmare begins. Night fell, draping Jake's small room in utter darkness. After the strange events of the day, he felt more exhausted than ever. His mind was tangled with nameless thoughts, but he kept telling himself that everything was just a coincidence. Yet, even as he closed his eyes, an unease slithered into his consciousness, like a nightmare waiting to take shape. The clock on the wall struck midnight. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the faint sound of wind slipping through the cracks of his window. Jake turned over, trying to find a more comfortable position. Then it happened. A sudden chill crept through the room. This wasn't normal. There was no draft, yet the air turned icy, as if the temperature had dropped drastically in an instant. Jake shivered and pulled his blanket higher, but a deep, unnatural cold crawled down his spine. His breath grew heavy, an invisible weight pressing on his chest. Anxiety coiled around his heart, though nothing seemed out of place. Until it began. A sound, faint at first. It was nothing more than a murmur, like the distant whisper of wind against old walls. But then it grew clearer. Jake's eyes snapped open. whispers, crying. The sound was weak, yet it echoed in his mind as if it came from everywhere at once. A voice filled with sorrow and desperation, calling to him from somewhere far beyond the physical world. Jake bolted upright, his pulse hammering in his ears. The room was still shrouded in darkness, yet something was wrong. His breathing turned ragged. Sweat beaded on his forehead. And then, a vision flashed through his mind. A woman. She stood there, silent, surrounded by thick mist. Her face was blurred, her hollow eyes empty yet brimming with sorrow. Her lips moved slightly as if trying to speak. Jake wanted to move, to look away, but his body was frozen in place. His lungs felt constricted, his heartbeat erratic. He couldn't see her face clearly, but something about her filled him with unspeakable dread. "Help me." The whisper rang out, closer than before. Too close. Jake felt the breath of the words against his ear. He screamed. His body jerked violently as he tumbled out of bed. His chest heaved, his breath coming in short, frantic gasps. He whipped his head around, eyes wide with terror. But the room, it was the same. Silent. Empty. No woman, no crying. Only his own ragged breaths, the frantic pounding of his heart, and the lingering terror still gripping his soul. Jake ran a trembling hand through his hair, trying to steady himself. A dream. It was just a dream. But it felt so real, too vivid, too lifelike. And the worst part? He knew. It wasn't over. For the rest of the night, Jake couldn't sleep. He sat there, listening, waiting. Any moment now, he expected the voice to return, the whispers to seep back into the darkness. But the hours passed in silence. And when the first light of dawn streamed through his window, he let out a shaky breath. But deep down, he knew. This was only the beginning. The nightmare had only just begun. The nightmare continues. Night fell once again, but Jake no longer felt at peace. Ever since the terrifying nightmare the night before, he couldn't stop thinking about the mysterious woman. Her voice still echoed in his mind, distant, fragile, yet unrelenting. "Help me." A shiver ran down Jake's spine. That wasn't just an ordinary dream. It was too vivid, too real. Fear clung to him like a shadow he couldn't shake. Still, he reassured himself that once he left this place, everything would end. But it didn't. That night, the moment he lay down, he was dragged into yet another nightmare. He stood in the middle of a desolate field, shrouded in thick fog. The air was deathly cold, carrying a strange, damp scent of decay. Everything was eerily silent, except for the whispering wind rustling through the barren trees. Then, out of the mist, a figure slowly emerged. Jake held his breath. It was her, the woman with long, tangled hair obscuring her face. She stood motionless, yet the atmosphere around her grew unbearably heavy. A suffocating pressure spread through Jake's chest. "Help me." The voice was clearer this time, closer, as if she was standing right in front of him. Jake wanted to run, but his legs wouldn't move. His heart pounded wildly as the woman slowly lifted her head. For the first time, he saw her face. Jake froze. Her skin was deathly pale, drained of all life. Her hollow, empty eyes held an unbearable sorrow. Her lips moved as if trying to speak, but no sound came out. Then suddenly, she screamed. A blood-curdling shriek shattered the silence. Jake's heart nearly stopped. He stumbled backward, but the ground beneath him vanished. He was falling. A bottomless void swallowed him whole. The wind roared past his ears, his mind spiraling into sheer panic. Jake shot up in bed, gasping for air. The dim glow of his bedside lamp cast weak shadows on the wall. His heart still thundered in his chest, sweat dripping down his forehead. He ran a shaky hand through his hair, trying to calm his ragged breathing. Then he looked down at his hands. and froze. There was dirt under his fingernails. Jake's breath hitched. Dark, damp soil clung to his fingertips, as if he had been digging into the earth. A chilling dread crawled up his spine. He was certain. His hands were clean before he went to sleep. What the hell was happening? Panic surged through him as he bolted into the bathroom, scrubbing his hands furiously. But no matter how much he washed, the eerie sensation of that dirt remained, lingering on his skin like a ghostly presence. The woman's face burned into his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was trying to tell him something. Who was she? And why did she keep appearing in his dreams? Jake knew one thing. If this continued, he would lose his mind. He needed answers. He needed to know what was really going on. With no other choice, Jake made a decision. He would return to the grave. Fear gripped him, but he couldn't ignore this any longer. Something was buried beneath that soil, something hidden in the darkness. And there was only one way to uncover the truth. Taking a deep breath, Jake braced himself. Whatever was waiting for him, he had a feeling it would change his life forever. The grave. Jake drove back to the forest where he had first found the unmarked grave. His heart felt heavy as the headlights cut through the dense canopy, illuminating the narrow path covered in dry leaves. The silence around him was unnerving, broken only by the low hum of his engine against the cold night air. He wasn't sure if coming back was a mistake, but the nightmares wouldn't stop. She, the mysterious woman, kept appearing every night, her empty eyes staring, her weak voice calling out, and her face becoming clearer each time. It was as if she was trying to tell him something. Jake pulled over, turning off the engine. A heavy stillness settled around him, carrying the damp, earthy scent of the deep woods. As he stepped out, a cold gust of wind cut through him, sending a chill down his spine. Fear coiled in his chest, but he forced himself to move forward. With a flashlight in hand, he followed the same path into the woods. Each step on the brittle leaves echoed in the silence, amplifying the tension in the air. And then he saw it. The grave. Just a small mound of dirt. No headstone, no markings, nothing to indicate who had been buried there. But something was different. The rock he had placed on the grave the other day had been moved. Jake's heartbeat thundered in his ears. Had someone been here? Or something else? He crouched down, his fingers trembling as he lifted the rock. The soil beneath it had been disturbed. A wave of cold dread washed over him. This was no coincidence. This wasn't just his imagination. Suddenly, a sharp gust of wind tore through the trees, carrying with it a chilling whisper. Jake froze. Wind didn't make sounds like that. That was a voice. Faint, weak, but unmistakably a woman's. His throat went dry, his pulse hammering wildly. "Help me!" Jake shot to his feet, instinctively stepping back. The flashlight in his hand flickered, casting erratic shadows over the ground. For the first time, true fear gripped him. The overwhelming sense that something not of this world was standing right beside him. The darkness around him thickened, swallowing the light. And then, he saw her. A figure stood amidst the swirling mist, right beside the grave. Her long, tangled hair concealed her face. A tattered white dress fluttered in the cold breeze. She didn't move. She didn't make a sound. She just stood there staring at him. Jake felt like he was drowning in the black depths of her eyes. His feet refused to move. Then, she took a step forward. Then another. The brittle leaves crunched under her weight. Jake's world spun. The air around him felt like it was being sucked away, his chest tightening with each frantic heartbeat. She came closer, her face slowly emerging from the shadows. And then, Jake recognized her. The realization crashed into him like a tidal wave, obliterating every coherent thought. That face, It was familiar, not a stranger, not just a nameless spirit. Someone connected to him. Jake's mouth opened, but no words came out. Horror clawed at his insides. How was this possible? He had never met her before. And yet, he knew her. Jake stumbled back, heart pounding. But before he could react, she was gone, vanished without a trace. No sound, no lingering presence. Only the silent grave and the suffocating dread that wrapped around the lonely forest. Jake took a shaky breath, his entire body trembling from the bone-deep cold. He knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. The whisper in the dark. Jake stumbled back, his breath coming in short, frantic gasps. The woman was gone, vanished without a trace. But the icy chill still clung to him, wrapping around his body like a phantom presence, as if she were still there, lurking in the shadows of the forest. The silence was deafening. The once constant hum of insects had ceased entirely, replaced by an unnatural stillness. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, watching his every move. Jake swallowed hard, gripping his flashlight tighter. He had to get out of here, now. But just as he turned to run, something touched his shoulder. Jake flinched violently, spinning around. But there was no one there. Nothing but the endless, suffocating darkness. His heart pounded in his chest. He had felt it. A hand. Cold, thin fingers pressing into his shoulder for the briefest moment. Jake staggered back, his hands trembling so badly he nearly dropped the flashlight. A wave of terror crashed over him, tightening around his lungs. And then, in the stillness of the night, a whisper brushed against his ear. "Don't leave me." Jake froze. His throat went dry. It was her voice. Soft, broken, laced with sorrow. And something else. Something darker. Jake couldn't take it anymore. He spun around and ran. Branches scraped against his arms. Leaves crunched beneath his feet. But he didn't stop. He didn't dare look back. He just ran as fast as his legs would carry him, desperate to escape the nightmare closing in around him. But then, footsteps behind him, not his own. Something was chasing him. Jake pushed himself harder, but the footsteps quickened to match his pace. They were right behind him, closing the distance with every frantic step. Panic clawed at his chest. His breaths came in ragged gasps as he tore through the woods, flashlight beam flickering wildly over the gnarled trees. And then, the darkness swallowed him whole. Jake tripped. His body slammed against the ground, his head striking the cold, leaf-covered earth. Pain exploded in his skull, his vision flickering in and out. And then, silence. The footsteps were gone. Jake lay there, gasping for air, trying to steady his racing heart. Slowly, he lifted his head. His flashlight had rolled a few feet away, its weak glow casting long, twisted shadows over the trees. No one was there. But something was wrong. Jake could feel it. Something was standing right next to him. He went rigid. He didn't move, didn't breathe, because he could hear it. A breath, right behind his ear. Slowly, trembling, Jake shifted his gaze to the side. And then, he saw her, right next to him. Pale, lifeless skin. Hollow, empty eyes. Her mouth hung open as if she were screaming, but no sound came out. A skeletal hand reached toward him. Jake screamed. He scrambled to his feet and ran. He didn't care about the branches whipping at his face, didn't care about the pain searing through his muscles. He just ran. Then finally, he saw it. His car. Jake lunged forward, yanking the door open with shaking hands. He fumbled with the keys, nearly dropping them in his blind panic. The engine roared to life as he slammed his foot on the gas, tires skidding against the dirt. The car lurched forward, tearing away from the nightmare lurking in the woods. But just as relief began to creep in, a whisper inside the car. "You can't escape me." Jake's blood ran cold. Dread coiled around his spine as he forced himself to look at the rearview mirror. And there, she was, sitting in the back seat, hair cascading over her shoulders, her hollow black eyes locked onto his. Jake's scream tore through the night as the car swerved violently. He tried to regain control, but the terror had already sunk its claws into his mind. And then, everything went dark. They're still following. The car swerved violently, tearing through the cold, empty night. Jake was losing it. His heart pounded like a drum against his ribcage as his wide, frantic eyes locked onto the rearview mirror. She was still there. Her pale face was barely visible against the suffocating darkness, but those deep, hollow eyes never blinked. Her long, tangled hair draped over her shoulders, clumped together as if she had just crawled out of the earth. The air inside the car grew thick, suffocating. Jake struggled to breathe. He wanted to scream. He wanted to slam his foot on the gas and get as far away as possible. But his limbs felt paralyzed, as if unseen chains had bound him in place. His throat was dry. His breaths came in sharp, shallow gasps, each one colder than the last, as if the life was slowly being drained from him. Then she opened her mouth. No words came out. Only a faint, raspy hiss, like the whisper of something long dead. A shiver crawled down Jake's spine. He wanted to turn around, to look directly at her and convince himself this was just his imagination. But fear gripped him too tightly, pinning him to his seat. And then, in the mirror, she moved. Her head tilted slightly. Those empty, soulless eyes never wavered. "Why, did you leave me?" A fragile, broken voice, right next to his ear. Jake screamed. The wheel jerked as he lost control. The car veered off the road, skidding over dead leaves, tires digging into the damp earth. A brutal impact sent his body slamming forward, his head crashing against the steering wheel. Pain exploded in his skull, his vision momentarily going black. And then, silence. A suffocating, deathly silence. Jake gasped for breath, his mind spinning. A warm trickle of blood slid down his forehead, but the pain was nothing compared to the terror clawing at his chest. The air inside the car was wrong, still, heavy, drenched in the scent of damp soil and decay, like something had been buried here for far too long. Jake swallowed hard. Where was she? His trembling hand reached for the flashlight that had fallen onto the seat beside him. Slowly, cautiously, he turned his head toward the back seat. Nothing. She was gone. But something still felt off. The air felt tainted. As if something had changed. Something unseen, yet undeniably present. The pressure in the car was unbearable, suffocating, like the walls themselves were closing in on him. Jake clenched his jaw and lifted the flashlight, angling it toward the rearview mirror. The beam hit the glass, and a face stared back at him. White, motionless, just inches behind him. Jake screamed. He shoved the door open, stumbling out into the cold night. His foot sank into the damp, rotting earth. A nauseating wetness seeped into his shoes as he took off running, his heartbeat hammering in his ears. He didn't care about the car anymore. He just had to get away. He ran blindly into the night, deeper into the forest, the darkness swallowing him whole. He didn't know where he was going. He only knew one thing. If he stopped running, she would catch him. The forest stretched endlessly around him. Twisted branches clawed at the sky like skeletal hands. Shadows bled together, shifting, warping, morphing into grotesque shapes in the flickering light of his flashlight. And then, he heard it. Footsteps, software slow, but deliberate. Following him. Jake clenched his teeth, refusing to look back. But every nerve in his body screamed that someone, something, was right behind him. He stopped. His chest heaved. His knuckles turned white around the flashlight. The footsteps stopped too. Silence pressed in from all sides. Jake took a deep breath. He couldn't take it anymore. He spun around, flashlight raised. Nothing. Just the empty forest. Just the wind whispering through the dead branches. But then, his flashlight beam flickered downward, and his breath caught in his throat. There, in the damp, rotting soil. Footprints, not his. Jake's stomach twisted. He was sure of it now. Someone had been following him. A cold breath ghosted across the back of his neck. Jake's body locked up. A hand, thin, skeletal, settled on his shoulder. "You can't run." The whisper curled into his ear. Jake screamed and bolted. The night swallowed him whole. But no matter how fast he ran, the footsteps never stopped. No escape. Jake sprinted through the darkness, his breath ragged, each heartbeat feeling like it was being crushed in a tightening grip. The twisted branches overhead stretched out like skeletal hands, reaching for him. The damp, decaying leaves crunched under his feet, the sound unnervingly loud in the eerie silence of the night. But the most terrifying thing wasn't the darkness. It wasn't the empty, endless forest. It was the footsteps, right behind him. Jake knew she was chasing him. Whenever he ran faster, the footsteps quickened. Whenever he stopped, they stopped too. Like an invisible force always lurking just inches from his back, waiting for him to lower his guard before it struck. Jake tightened his grip on the flashlight, forcing himself to steady his breathing. He couldn't keep running forever. He would collapse sooner or later. He had to face it. Slowly, trembling, he turned around, raising the flashlight. The dim beam swept across the gnarled trees, casting warped shadows against the foggy night air. There was nothing there, but he knew. She was still there. The air around him thickened, pressing down on his shoulders like an invisible weight. A sudden gust of wind sent a chill through his spine, carrying a sickening scent, damp earth, decay, and something unmistakably metallic. Then, a voice whispered right beside his ear, "You can't run." Jake jerked around, flashlight flicking toward the sound. And there she was, standing right in front of him. Her skin was ghostly pale, her hair clinging to her face in damp, tangled strands. Her hollow, empty eyes swallowed the light, dark pits that reflected nothing. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came. Only an icy breath, curling into the night air like a ghostly fog. Jake staggered backward, but his foot caught on a tree root. He fell hard, his body slamming onto the damp forest floor. Pain shot through him, but panic drowned it out. His hands scrambled against the ground, pushing himself back, his wide eyes never leaving her. She stepped forward, slow, deliberate, unstoppable. "Did you forget me?" Jake's breath caught. That voice, it was familiar. A blurry memory flickered through his mind. A girl, a soft smile, eyes that gleamed in the sunlight. And then, a crash. Flashes of a wrecked car tumbling down a cliffside. Blood, screams shredding through the air. A desperate hand reaching out for help. And being let go. Jake froze. It was Alice, the girl he once loved. The girl he betrayed. He had left her there, trapped in the burning wreckage of that car. He had walked away, pretending it never happened. But the past had never truly left him. Now she was back. Jake shuddered, his breaths breaking apart into ragged gasps. He tried to speak, but his throat tightened, choking off the words. Alice leaned closer, her face mere inches from his. "You promised. You'd never leave me." Jake's lungs seized. Suddenly, Alice knelt down, pressing a freezing hand against his chest. A wave of unbearable cold flooded into him, seeping through his skin, sinking into his very soul. Jake screamed. He felt it, his life draining away. Darkness closed in. And then, he saw himself. A lifeless body sprawled on the forest floor, skin deathly pale, eyes vacant, frozen in an expression of sheer horror, mouth hanging open, as if in a silent, eternal scream. Jake was dead. Alice let out a quiet, satisfied sigh. She rose to her feet, turned away, and stepped back into the shadows. Behind her, a corpse lay motionless in the dirt. Her footsteps faded into nothingness. The night swallowed everything whole.